With superstorms and natural disasters ravaging the planet, many scientists have claimed this as a result of climate change. I'm your host, Pelumi, and with me at the table today for a conversation on climate change is TMS Ruge of the World Bank's Connect for Climate program. Mr. Ruge, thanks for coming to the program.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
First, let me ask you this. How real is climate change?
It depends on who you're asking, right? Climate change to someone like you and me living here in the United States, where our life is very disconnected from living off of the land. Climate change is a bit of a distance until something like Superstorm Sandy hits, and then you're reminded that from a global perspective, the effects of climate change can be felt anywhere. When something like Superstorm Sandy kind of ravages New York, you kind of get connected again to the climate, don't you? We don't plant our own food here in the United States, so we don't get to see, a flood, taking out our plantation. We don't get to see a drought affecting our daily lives. But for someone like in the Sahel region, for example, or someone in Kenya, Uganda, we're very close to the land, and we live as one with nature, and so we get to feel that a lot more because of the way our lives are structured. So to us in the stories that we've heard, climate change, yes, is very, very real, and it's not like a religion that you have to believe in. The science is there, the effects are there, and we're starting to see that, and it's good to, in a way you could say it's good that something like Sandy happened so that we could have an honest, concrete discussion about the effects of climate change right now and move beyond is it real or is it a myth and begin working on sustainable solutions going forward.
You mentioned that the science is there. Okay, so if the science is irrefutable and we have superstorms like Sandy, so why are there still like great doubters, out there? I mean, how come you still have a large portion of the population, still very skeptical of climate change, regardless of the science that's out there?
Well, it depends. It depends on what population you're talking to. If you say, a majority of the African population, a majority of the Indian population, they know more and are concerned more about climate change, as we discussed before, is because those communities are very much connected to their environment, and they depend on their environment. If you're in North America or maybe perhaps Europe, you're a little bit more disengaged. So you getting and understanding the reasons for climate change might be a little bit harder. You have to be convinced because you don't necessarily feel it. As I said, until something like Sandy happens to you, and then you're like, oh, this is the evidence that they've been talking about. Now, in terms of those that are detractors in this community, and we see this mostly in the United States, there's vested interest in keeping the status quo, right? Let's keep polluting because we don't want to affect our profit margins. Let's keep producing carbon dioxide the way that we are because we don't want to do the hard work to green our industries. And other difficult decisions that have to be made that are both, a result of partisan politics, whatever it may be, or industry lobbying, to keep things the same way. Hopefully, after a few more catastrophes, and it's unfortunate that he has to get to that point, before we can truly begin believing the science and actually doing the hard work to change our mindsets and greening our lives a little bit more.
So what regions of the Earth are most susceptible to climate change right now?
Well, I mean, there isn't a specific area. I think we're also susceptible to climate change, as we have seen. I mean, if you're in the Sahel, you're certainly a lot more susceptible to climate change because you are dependent on your environment to live and to sustain yourself, and entire communities are. If you're in the United States, it might be a little bit different. It might be situational in terms of direct impact. You might feel it down the road in increased prices in commodities because they're hard to it's hard to access those commodities over time, whether it's the price of corn going up, the price of sugar going up, or the price of electricity going up, the price of gas going up. So different regions around the world feel it a little bit differently, but I think those communities more connected to the environment feel it much, much more. So, the United States continues to pollute, but Africa feels the effects a lot harder.
Yeah, because I think in preparing for this conversation, I read somewhere that Africa is responsible for, let's say, 4% of greenhouse emissions. Mm-hmm. But, global warming, which is an effect of climate change, is much more disastrous in Africa. Mm. So how come Africa is not the biggest polluter, but then Africa happens to be one of the...
But it is the most affected.
Yes.
Yeah, it is the most affected. As I said before, it's because we're so connected to the environment, our lifestyles. I mean, if you look at the way the economy is built for a lot of the continent, I think it's somewhere like 60 to 70% is very much agrarian. So when a drought hits, entire communities are devastated. When a flood hits, entire communities are devastated because those are our way of life. And that's how, farming is how we make money, how we live, how we pay for everything, how we sustain ourselves and our people. So we feel it a lot harder.
Okay. Now you are a media strategist for the Connect for Climate program at the World Bank. Mm. What are the biggest challenges facing the program right now?
I would have to say moving fast enough or having enough people to listen to all of the stories that we hear, because we're so passionate about hearing the voices of those at the last mile and how climate change affects them. I mean, if you know the bank and, in their open data initiative, they have data on everything, climate data, economic data on all of that. What we don't have enough of are those voices at the last mile. We don't have, the solutions directly from the ground up. We're trying to change the paradigm in where do we harness the solutions to the climate change issues. For the first time, we have a platform where we can tap into collective intelligence of the globe and say, we are all affected by climate change. But we're also we could be part of the solution. So how do we do that? Tell us how you're affected in your community, and what solutions are you enacting. And maybe perhaps your solution and your story could affect the lives of somebody, in a neighboring country or halfway around the world. So we want to connect those people with the innovative solutions that never had an audience to listen to them, and put that in front of the world for them to discuss. I mean, we've grown a massive audience of over 350,000 fans on Facebook. We have, a massive following on Twitter. We have, a LinkedIn group. We have a Facebook discussion groups for academics. So we have very many avenues for getting the word out, as well as to listening to what communities around the world are doing. So I would definitely have to say harnessing all of that collective intelligence is a hard problem.
Yeah, because in being able to access, the stories that you need, is that not dependent on technology? And for example, somewhere like Africa, where you have a lot of rural communities that do not have the technological access yet, and they are more likely to suffer as a result of drought or things of the nature. How do you get those stories where technology does not exist?
Well, I would have to kick back and say technology does exist in those communities, okay. and we have managed to actually use existing mechanisms that are there. In this new digital age, a lot of us forget that radio is a huge technology, transformative technology in these communities. Mobile is becoming a huge transformative technology. It's not infrastructure dependent, not in the way that other traditional mechanisms of media have been. But mobile has allowed us to really reach deep down into areas where we never thought we would go to. Last year, when the photo video competition was concentrated on Africa, ahead of the Durban COP18 meetings or COP17 meetings, we were challenged with collecting stories from all 54 countries And nobody really thought we could actually do it. And we were able to get stories from all of those countries. I mean, even Somalia sent in, really interesting stories because they're extremely concerned about climate change. Western Sahara sent us stories. Cape Verde sent us stories. So the presence of technology is extremely important, and it's evidence that it's transforming lives because it's giving everyone a voice. Even at the last mile, you have an opportunity to be heard. I mean, so we would use radio stations and tell them to run our ads, and we would do in French and in Portuguese and in English, or in different regions around the continent, and that would filter down down into the villages, and the youth would be able to go to a cafe if they didn't have a personal device, log in to connectforclimate.org and submit a story, of a video or a picture that they took on their mobile device. There are very many ways to collect that. So technology was very much at the heart of what we were able to do.
You mentioned earlier that climate change is a global phenomenon. So why should someone in Brazil believe that glacier melting in the Arctic will somehow affect him or her? When the Arctic is so far away, I live in Brazil. Why should how does that affect? How does that impact my life?
Well, that's a difficult question to kind of answer or put into a tangible measure and say, well, this is connected to this, especially when it's so far removed, right?
Yeah.
But then at the same time, you got to look at it from the perspective that climate change is not, it's not a religion. It's not like I have to tell you, you have to believe it in order for it to exist. It exists, whether or not you believe it. But the science is also there. So I think, in order to convince the skeptics, point them to where the science is and tell them, these are the facts. This is what's happening. This is the rise of global temperatures over 1,000 years. The science is there. The charts are there. The infographics are there. They tell you all of this information. And everybody can research for themselves if they're really interested. But the science is there. And you can decide which side of that debate you stand on. But either way, you can either be busy fixing the situation, or you can be busy discussing whether or not it's real, but you're still going to be affected either way.
So, I mean, the effects of climate change is irreversible, if I do understand correct, right?
If we don't act.
If we don't act, okay. So, I mean, the damage that's been done so far, can we reverse it? Or, or we stop with the damage of the past, but we can stop more damage from happening?
I think we still have an opportunity to really do something, but I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that as a global community, as a human community concerned about the future of this planet, that we will be more cognizant on the effects, our human effects on the environment and what it is that we're doing. I'm more concerned about educating the future populations of this planet on how we can live better and at one with our environment so that we're not doing further damage. I'm concerned about how we make green sexy so that more people can live greener lifestyles. Do you really have to own a car? Can you talk to your city council to design better cities where you can walk more, where you can bike more? I mean, I took my bike here. It took me 45 minutes to get here, and I enjoyed that. But the city is built in such a way where, if that's the lifestyle that you choose, you can enjoy it. And there's great public transport. Is that the solution to greenhouse gas emissions for large cities? Perhaps, perhaps not.
But what you said, the biggest polluters amongst us will have to curb their emissions, right? So if you have, states like the United States and other Western countries not being, would I say, romantic toward the idea. For example, former President George W. Bush, was not too thrilled with the Kyoto Accord, so it was a little bit very lukewarm on it because it felt like 80% of the world was now being forced to curb their emissions as well. You have countries like China, which does not necessarily play by the rules. So if we're actually going to make some impact, some improvement, some drastic cuts in our emissions, how do we engage states like China to cut back on their greenhouse emissions?
Well, I mean, that's definitely punching above my weight to answer the question. But if we look at it from a layman's perspective and say, yeah, of course that looks unfair. It's like, well, why do we have to pay for it, But and other countries don't have to. But then on the other side, of the argument, developing regions like Africa are looking at it and say, what do you mean we can't emit? We need industries for job creation and development and all of that. What do you mean we can't create those industries? Because our people need jobs.
Yes.
You guys were busy developing and creating these problems. Well, how do we develop without that very same path? So I think it's a hugely complicated problem, and probably the reason why we are at COP18 instead of solving the negotiations at COP1, right? But I think hopefully we are getting somewhere where everyone is attentive to the effects of climate change, because it's becoming so dire right now that the agreements become meaningful, and that action comes out of all of these discussions and agreements, so we can get to somewhere where we can actually say this is the strategy for all of us, getting to a solution that will curb further damage to the continent.
Our use of fossil fuel is very, is a contributing factor to climate change, right? We've seen a lot of hybrid vehicles and things of the nature. How fast do we have to go on that? How fast do we have to remove ourselves from fossil fuel to get to a desired state? Or do we just have to decrease it to a minimal level? Or what balance do we have to reach where, we could kind of be on a smooth tangent toward, slowing down our whole carbon dioxide emissions?
Well, I definitely think one of the things that we have to do first is to all of us understand the effects and to believe them. If you don't get a major subset of the population to change their behavior in how they live, but by making them understand how their lifestyle choices affect, in aggregate, the planet, you're not going to change very much. So I think the movement right now is to educate and to say we need to change behaviors in how we are developing going forward. As we were discussing before, are we building greener, smarter cities so that more people can live in a condensed area, so we have less of a footprint on the planet? What does that look like? Does that look like New York, a lot more condensed, or Amsterdam, extremely condensed, or does that look like Atlanta, where it's widely spread out and we can't readily fix that? How do you stop urban spread like Atlanta? I don't know if you've ever been to Atlanta before, but it's a massive problem to address very quickly. Or even in Texas, where it's all highways, and there isn't much of a public transport system. But I think slowly, we're starting to see those behavioral changes. I mean, Dallas itself is if I can pick a city as an example, is now starting to put in mass transit as a way to. Houston also is kind of doing the same thing. So I think a lot of the cities are kind of waking up to this smarter, greener, more concentrated, better designed cities that we need to begin thinking about in the future, and also making that sexy. But then you have to look at consumer behavior also. Do I buy a Hummer or do I buy a Tesla, right? Yeah, completely electric. Why should I switch? So I think there's a bit of marketing that has to be done to influence behavior change. And in the decisions that we are kind of making, I think for the most part, it's the consumers that have to make that choice.
Then it seems to me some sort of catch-22 when you look like the continent, like Africa, where there's a rapid race to develop, and we talked about urbanization just not too long ago. So, can we achieve a desired urbanization level, a desired rate of urbanization without contributing to the status quo?
Well, it depends also. I mean, one of the first things that you have to ask yourself is like, do we have to urbanize?
Okay.
Or do we make agriculture smarter to curb the rate of urbanization? Is because we're moving from agricultural areas, from rural communities to the cities because we're looking for opportunities. So I think we have to look at the situation in a smarter perspective and say, how do we curb the movement of population migration towards the cities? How do we make farming sexy? How do we make farming lucrative to where farmers can say, you know what, I can make even more staying exactly where I am right now instead of moving into the city, more concentrated, dirty, pollute, all of that pollution. The more people move there, greater demand for energy. How do we redistribute energy? Because if you think about it also in some African cities, a lot of people also move to the city because they have access to the grid and have electricity and better amenities and those kinds of things. How do we disaggregate the grid, should I say, in such a way that we can distribute power anywhere without needing a central grid? We know how hard it is to run lines all the way to the village so they can have electricity. How do we provide them those opportunities to electrify their lives and live the kind of same lifestyle as you would have in the city, and so that we can reduce that migration? I think we need to think smarter in terms of Africa's development from that perspective, and we need to use those education conduits, especially within the diaspora, and use of technology and access to that technology within our education system on the continent to include climate change as an important portion of the education curriculum.
So how much of that education can we leave to civil society, and how much of that education has to be undertaken by government,
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think there are opportunities for both, because if you think about it, if the government isn't behind it, but the private sector is, you don't have a policy framework for whatever the private sector does. And if it's just one party or the other, it isn't really a full-blown out solution. So there might be areas where a PPP, public-private partnership, might be the best way to actually do this, where everybody is on board, is on the same table. Kind of like kind of like the way the tech sector is kind of built on. You need policy to allow for for competition, to allow for standards, to allow for investment, and then you need the private sector for that innovation and that funding and that consumer behavior training and advertising and mobilizing and those kinds of things. So I think we do need the government to lead from that perspective, because this is something that is completely new. The government needs to, our governments need to be, how can I put it? They need to have foresight and say, this is an impending problem. We have 500 million youth under the age of 15. We need to look out for their future. How do we do that? And then begin to answer those questions going forward and setting frameworks and saying, our future looks like this, and if we want it to be any different, we have to act now.
Do you think there's a disconnect between the older generation and the younger generation when it comes to climate change? Do you think the younger ones, your generation, our generation, tend to be more believers in climate change as opposed to my father's, my grandfather's generation will probably believe that, it's what it is.
But you know what? I think the older generation actually does believe climate change, probably more than the youth. And the reason that is because the older generation lived very much close to the land. They, that's all that they had. You could predict the very day that you needed to clear your land and plant. You could predict the very day that you needed to harvest, when the rains were coming, when the rains were going to stop. You knew all of that. But now that's a little bit more challenging. So when you talk to them, they're saying things have changed. But this new generation is all about tech. Is all about not really learning how to live off of the land. So I think it depends. It depends which side of the youth bubble you're on. Are you the progressive youth? Are you into technology? Can educate, self-educated, have that information out there? Are you working in a sector that is easily affected by climate change? I think there's a little bit of a balance there in who believes and who doesn't believe more. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. We all need to. We all need to. We all need to.
And I understand that you have a competition over the Connect for Climate.
Yeah, we do. You know, and thanks for bringing that up. After last year's success with engaging African youth on climate change, we decided to open up the competition and go global. Okay. So currently, right now, we have a competition called Voices for Climate, and you can go to voicesforclimate.org. That's voices, the number 4, climate.org to enter. And we're looking for voices from around the world, the same way we looked at. We're looking for videos. We're looking for photos, and we're also looking for music videos, produced from around the world. About specifically climate change. If you go to the website, you can find out all the categories in which you can enter, and the competition ends at midnight, December 31st.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Teddy, for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
And that's our program for tonight. Thanks for watching.